Okay, let's move on to other news now, because the UN Security Council, which was supposed to be focusing on relief efforts for war-ravaged Ghouta in Syria, has descended instead into threats. The US envoy warned that Washington is ready to strike the Syrian government.
We also warn any nation that is determined to impose its will through chemical attacks and inhuman suffering, most especially the outlaw Syrian regime. The United States remains prepared to act if we must. It is not the path we prefer, but it is a path we have demonstrated we will take, and we are prepared to take it again.
Our correspondent Caleb Maupin joins me live from New York. He was covering events there. Caleb, unless I misunderstood, that sounded like a clear threat from the US ambassador.
Indeed. In her remarks, U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley essentially used the language often used to justify U.S. military interventions, saying that the USA essentially reserves the right to attack the Syrian government. Now, the meeting was convened to discuss the situation in eastern Ghouta. This is a rebel-held enclave where there is fighting taking place between terrorists and extremists that are trying to overthrow the Syrian government and the Syrian government itself. Now, when Nikki Haley got up to speak, rather than simply touching on the situation and the plight of civilians and efforts to make sure that civilians are not hurt, she actually chose to make a barrage of allegations against Russia, Iran, and Syria. And in her remarks, she went as far as saying that the three countries were actually responsible for some chlorine attacks. Now, then we heard a response from the Russian ambassador who said this is simply a disinformation campaign. This is what we heard from Nikki Haley and the response from the Russian representative.
And in the past 16 days, there have been 3 separate allegations of chlorine gas attacks. This is no ceasefire. This is the Assad regime, Iran, and Russia continuing to wage war against their political opponents.
We understand that the goal of this disinformation campaign is to manipulate public opinion and convince people the Syrian government is using chemical weapons. But we have reasonable concerns that there are preparations to stage fake chemical attacks in order to later accuse the Assad government. And according to our data, on the 5th of March, the al-Nusra terrorists used chlorine in eastern Ghouta, injuring 30 people.
Now, Nikki Haley, in her remarks, said that the United States is putting forward a new draft resolution regarding the situation in eastern Ghouta that wouldn't have what she calls terrorism loopholes. Now, the current resolution allows for the Syrian government to continue fighting against al-Nusra and other extremist groups that have been operating in eastern Ghouta. Now, the new resolution put forward by the United States, according to what we heard from Nikki Haley, would prevent that from taking place. They would not be able to continue doing so. Now, that would essentially leave the terrorists and extremists operating in eastern Ghouta intact and in power, and allow them to continue staging public executions, using civilians as human shields, and doing other activities that the entire international community has condemned. Now, again, this meeting was supposed to be about how to take efforts to protect civilians in eastern Ghouta. However, Nikki Haley used the meeting as a place to make accusations and essentially demonize and attack the Russian government. Now, this is not the first time that she's done this at the UN Security Council. Let's take a look at what Nikki Haley has said in the past.
Last time I promised to count how many times the US envoy would mention Russia during her statement. I counted. It's 22.
Russians, 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 and the Russians. Russia
is done for political purposes only and not out of care for civilians.
Now, the purpose of the UN Security Council, the 15-member body that leads the United Nations, is supposed to be to carry out the mission of the United Nations. But as we have seen, it has recently become a forum for certain countries to criticize other countries. Now, everyone in the UN Security Council seems to be in full agreement that the lives of civilians in eastern Ghouta should be protected. However, there are some pretty strong disagreements about how that should be carried out and how and who is responsible for the situation there. And we've heard some rather extreme rhetoric in the 15-member body that leads the United Nations.
Many thanks, Kelly Maupin, our correspondent, bringing us right up to date live from New York. OK, well, joining me now is Amar Wakaf. Here we go. We've got him up on our big screen for this interview. Middle East expert and director of the Gnosis think tank. Good to speak to you, Amar. What do you make of the US envoy's speech at the UN Security Council? It was, I think, unexpected. Nobody thought that she was going to be delivering threats, perhaps.
Well, we think that this is because the United States is trying to change the nature of its engagement in Syria towards becoming more offensive. I think everybody, and we've heard a lot of calls in the West, most recently the British foreign minister saying that there is no hope that we can give to the people of Eastern Ghouta, that the West is going to come and do some military engagement in order to, change the position to a more favorable one for them. So in a sense, they're telling the people of Eastern Ghouta, we're not going to come and save you. So we think this sort of threat is will, be, I wouldn't say limited, but actually connected to other areas in Syria that are expected to face the same military operation, perhaps northern Homs and southern Hama, that sort of enclave, Idlib, or even northeastern Syria. So the United States, what they're saying is that we are willing to use force if the Syrian military go beyond whatever line we've drawn, and we're not going to tell it to anyone, but definitely not for Ghouta.
It's quite incredible, and some people would interpret that as the US is siding with the terrorists against the Syrian government, which is quite a remarkable situation to consider. Is it a serious threat?
We think it is a serious threat in the sense that nothing that the United States have done in Syria so far, bringing all its military and airplanes, is legal. So there is nothing really preventing them from doing another thing that is illegal. What the United States should be concerned about, perhaps, is the civilians. There are about 300 or 400,000 people in Eastern Ghouta that need to get rid of these militants. They need to go back to their normal lives. There are about 6 or 7 million people in Damascus that need to go back to their normal lives, and everybody is expecting this operation to end up just like what happened in eastern Aleppo, with the militants going elsewhere and people, 90% of the population over there, which is what happened in eastern Aleppo, going back to normal life, kids to school, and people to hospitals and work and everything. So the United States need to be more concerned with the lives of these people. I don't think anyone can realistically say that everybody in Eastern Ghouta is an anti-Syrian government. Surely someone must say, well, at least there is some proportion of people of Eastern Ghouta who want rid of those militants, especially the Islamic ones, especially the extreme ones like Jabhat al-Nusra and what have you. But the United States isn't at all interested in that. They're interested in forcing the Syrian government's hand in order to effect a political change that the United States would like, using whatever means they have. And we think that the situation in northeastern Syria in specific, whereby local Kurdish groups are becoming more and more empowered by the United States in order to have a quasi-state of some sort in northeastern Syria, and the United States might dig their heels over there.
I don't think anybody doubts that there have been deaths in eastern Ghouta, and they've included civilian deaths. The US is proposing to ban all anti-terrorist operations. My question to you would be, public will be saying this is great, we'll stop innocent deaths, but it leaves the civilians in the hands of the terrorists who Russia says are carrying out their own atrocities upon the people there. Will the people of eastern Ghouta be any better off left in the hands of terrorists who are no longer under assault?
Well, the figures we have from the similar operation we had about 18 months ago in eastern Aleppo was that there was about, according to UN figures, there was about 300,000 people, besieged in eastern Aleppo. And when the buses ferried the militants and their families out of eastern Aleppo, there were about 30,000 people who chose to leave eastern Aleppo. That tells you that there are 9 out of 10 people in eastern Aleppo chose to stay. You could easily argue that those people, 9 out of 10, were hostages, and you could also argue that there is a similar proportion in eastern Ghouta, and not only that, We're talking now about 300,000 or so civilians in eastern Ghouta. Douma alone, as a city in eastern Ghouta, or the main city in eastern Ghouta, had 1 million inhabitants before the crisis. Now, a lot of people, one could argue, migrated from or deserted eastern Ghouta or managed to desert actually, because for the past 5 years no one was allowed to leave the militants' area. But those who managed to get out of eastern Ghouta would also like to go back to their houses. So, you know, not only 9 out of 10 in eastern Ghouta would be happy to see the back of the militants, but perhaps as much as 1.5 million people outside would like to see them off so that they can go back and check their houses and see whether everything is fine or whether there is anything left at all.
I appreciate your time. My guest, Ammar Wakaf, Middle East expert, director of the Gnosis think tank. Thank you.